Hello and welcome to Katrina's Creations. This is a Wednesday episode, and today's episode is going to be about what do I keep in my notions pouch. So before I get started, the shawl that I am wearing is called the Round Dance. It is a knitted shawl. It is a free pattern. It's a one skein wonder, as they call it. So you can do it with one skein of yarn. And here's what it looks like. It has bobble stitches in it. And I wish I could remember what the name of this yarn was because it is so extremely soft. It's not an alpaca. I keep having this funny feeling that it might have been some type of an acrylic, but it is like wearing a baby blanket. It is just so cozy and toasty and soft. So I've got it back around my neck, and I've got my cup of tea in this cute little llama knitting cup that my supervisor gave me for my birthday, along with some tea. So I've got that warming up. So let's get started. Now the pouch that I use, unfortunately, is not available anymore. This was an IKEA cosmetic bag, and I think it was at the time like $2.99, but I love this thing because it is structured. In other words, it holds its shape. It has an outside pocket, and then it has the inside pocket, but the zipper was really, really nice. They actually sold a bigger version of this, which I turned into a pocketbook and put handles on it. And then the inside is just lined with like a gray, there you can see kind of a gray lining. Like I said, I don't think you can even get these anymore. Last I checked, they don't have them. But the outside pouch here, I actually keep whatever I'm going to use all the time in here. Now I knit and I crochet, so the tools I keep in my toolbox are both for knitting and for crochet. So the outside pocket, like I said, is things I use all the time. So there is a pair of scissors, there is a tape measure, there is a ruler, and you might say, why do you have a tape measure and a ruler? If you are checking gauge, it's much easier to have something that's rigid to be able to put against it rather than try to hold your work down and try to open this up and measure it at the same time. So I just find that a small little 6-inch ruler works for that. Then I have a crochet hook. This is a size F. So you can see that. And I keep this to help weave in ends sometimes. Sometimes I use a needle, sometimes I just grab the crochet hook. But I have found with knitting, if I drop a stitch, and this is like a small to medium size hook on the end, I can use that to pick up the dropped stitches. Another tool you can use, and I got this at a knitting retreat recently, it looks like a latch hook, but it's a little bit smaller than your average latch hook. So you can see it has a lever that comes down. This is actually part of it goes to a knitting machine is what these go to, and it's for this is one of the needles on the knitting machine. And then they put a handle on it. So they gave these away to us free, but my own personal choice is the plain old crochet hook because I tend to get my yarn snagged on the little arm that goes up and down here. And then the last thing I have in here is some outdated business cards, which you won't be able to see it close enough, but really need to update. I've got 500 of these things. I could wallpaper with them. But it's a little bit outdated because it still has my Ravelry account and doesn't have my Love Crafts account. But when I did this, I spelled podcast wrong. I homeschooled my children. How scary is that? I left the D out, so it's like podcast. Yes, it says Katrina's Creations Knitting Podcast because originally it was strictly a knitting podcast, and then I started crocheting, so I changed it to Katrina's Creations Crafting Podcast. So it would incorporate all the other things I do besides knitting. So that's what I keep in the outside pocket. Now, what do I keep in the inside pocket? I have a couple things that are laying loose. First I have this little teeny change purse that I keep beads in. If I am working on a beaded project, that's where they live. I just keep them in there and they tuck in. And I got this off of eBay. There was like, this is the smallest, there was this like a size, 4 different sizes I think, for under $5. And it's purple, so you know, I had to get it. Then I have, this is a Tic Tac box. You like Tic Tac candies? Except I keep my darning needles in there, and I have quite a bit of them, you can see. I have a bunch, and yeah, so I just keep them handy, and I just find that they work, they fit perfect into the little Tic Tac box. Then I have these 2 larger stitch holders. Now if you're not a knitter, stitch holders are used to hold stitches on, like on your shoulders or your neckline while you're still working in pattern. A lot of times it will have you put the armhole stitches separate, to be held separate. And so that's what a stitch holder is. So I have 2 larger ones, and then I have 2 small ones as well. So then I have this little pouch here that I tuck inside. I have a large one of these too that I use to hold my circular knitting needles. I got these off of eBay. They are like maybe 3 by 5, and they're vinyl, and they have a little zipper on them, and they're like a heavy-duty sandwich bag type of thing. And then they've got a space here where you can put rings, and these are just the little notebook rings you can get at the Dollar Tree, and I just have those fastened through to hold them together. And so I can keep multiple things but keep them separated. They'd even be great to use in your purse with different things. But so let's go see what I've got in there. I have point protectors and needle keepers. So this is a needle keeper. It looks like a little pair of binoculars. You can see it has a hole through it. What that does is you actually slide you slide both needles through this. They stick out the other side, but it holds all the stitches on so they aren't going to fall off while you're transporting it. So I have those in a couple of different sizes. And then there are point protectors. And point protectors will also keep your stitches on your needles, but they also, if you have very, very sharp points, these aren't, but if I had very sharp points, I could put that over the top of it and it would keep it from poking through things or poking me. So yeah, and they're just like a rubber material. Sometimes they come in foam and they're usually pretty cheap. I honestly don't use them that much because I don't tend to use that sharp of knitting needles. I would hurt myself. So the next thing I have is a row counter, and this is the type, it can slide right onto your knitting needles. It has a hole through the center, as you can see, and then you turn these little white sides here and it turns the number right here of what row you're on. Now they are primarily for knitting, however you could put them onto a crochet hook as well. You know, they will slide on like that, and then you could crochet and keep track of which row you're on at the same time. Here I have the rest of my Dorset button pieces. So if you missed that tutorial, you can click the little link over here, and that will take you to the Dorset button tutorial. Here's what they look like when they're made up. And here is a red one. The next one I have, you may go, why do you have these? These are just your simple bread clips. But if you've got a long tail of yarn that you're, whether you're knitting or you're crocheting, if you've got a beginning, like a beginning piece of the yarn, and you don't want to cut it too short, but it keeps getting in the way, you can wind it like around and through the bread twisty thing, and it keeps it out of your way. Next, I have a whole selection of cable needles. Now these are for knitting. I know that you can cable with crochet, but I'm not that advanced of a crocheter yet, so I have no idea if you use hooks when you crochet or not. I don't think so. If you do, let me know down below in the comments. But I have various sizes. I have tons of these things in large and all the way down to really small. And here I have two more of these stitch holders. These are just really small ones. They're about 3 to 4 inches. But these thingies make great shawl pins. If you open them up, and I actually have a shawl pin that I made this with, you can get these for like $1 or $2. If you open them up like this and just bend them open, because they're just metal, and you slide on some of the fancy beads that you can find like at Joann's or Hobby Lobby, and you slide those on and then bend it back shut again, instant shawl pin, and it's really super cheap. And you can have several of them in different colors. So yeah, that's what that is. The next thing is stitch markers. Now I have a couple different types of stitch markers. I have some that are not fixed. They look like big safety pins, and they're plastic, and you can just, they're movable and removable. So you can latch them shut, and you can move them as you go through your knitting or crochet. Or they have fixed ones, and fixed ones are just a solid ring. Let's see if I can show you one. And here's one that's just a solid ring. Now, what's the difference, you might ask, between using a solid one and using one that is movable? With knitting, it doesn't really matter because you're just slipping it from one needle to the next, and a stitch marker is used to catch your attention whenever you're going to change a pattern. For instance, this is a baby blanket I'm working on right now, and you can see that I have stitch markers because my pattern changes in between. Here I have garter stitch, and then here is the pattern design. So if I don't have to be watching constantly, these kind of keep it in my head when I get to that stitch marker that the pattern's going to change. Now crocheting, you could do very similar things with, but you would want to use a removable one so that, like I said, with knitting, it just moves up as you slip it from one needle to the next. But with crochet, you can use it to mark the beginning or the end of a row, like where your first or last stitch is. And you can also use it to mark wherever your pattern would be changing, but you would need the type that are removable, so you can just take them out and move them to the next row as you go. So those are stitch markers. And then I have progress keepers. Now some progress keepers can also be used, like this one. This is a little cookie. This one has a removable, you can't really see it real well, but it has one of those kind of light bulb shaped safety pins that you could use as a stitch marker, because you go through the bulbous end of it and it would work as a stitch marker, or you can use it as a progress keeper or a removable stitch marker. But most of them have like a lobster claw on the end, like this one. Now you may say, what in the world do you use a progress keeper for? Progress keepers are great for keeping track of which is your right and your wrong side of your work, but they're also good to know how far you've knit or crocheted from the time you started to the time you stop. So this is this week's progress, and here I am here. So I know I've knit about 1.5 inches at this point. And this comes especially in handy, not just when you're doing a podcast and you want to show how much progress you've made, but if you are knitting or crocheting something and you are told knit or crochet 12 inches to the underarm to start for your sleeve, it helps if you can mark that spot and then you know how far up you need to go. You know, or if you have to do a sleeve or whatever and it tells you either knit or crochet 6 inches before you begin your decreases, it helps if you have a starting point and a stopping point, and so that progress keeper can help for that as well. So that's the different uses for a progress keeper. So that is what's in my little bundle of goodies. Now I thought I would show you a couple of little cheating stitches and tips for knitting. I know most of you that watch are crocheters, and you guys are so much more advanced than I am that I wouldn't even begin to show you a shortcut because I'm not that experienced with crochet. However, with knitting, there are some tips that I can show you on some basic stitches that can make things a little bit easier. So let's get started. The first tip I'm going to show is an alternate way to do the SSK, or slip slip knit stitch. Now this is a decrease. It is the opposite of knitting 2 together. So a knit 2 together causes the stitch to slant one way. An SSK, or slip slip knit, causes the stitch to slant the other way. Now the traditional way to do an SSK is to use your right needle and you go purlwise and you slip 1 stitch, you slip a 2nd stitch, and then you take your left needle and you insert it back through, again purlwise, and then you knit the stitch. That's the traditional way of doing it. But there's a much easier way to do this. Take your right needle, here's 2 stitches, you're going to slip them purlwise, but instead of slipping them to the right needle, you're going to slip the right needle into the back, and then you're going to just knit the 2 stitches together. Now here you can see the 2 together. This is the traditional, this is the modified. They look identical. They do the identical thing, but they save you a step. So again, to do that, you are going to take your right needle, insert it purlwise through the back of the stitch. So I've got 2 captured here, and then just knit. And there you have it. So that's tip number 1. Tip number 2 is make 1 left and make 1 right. This is an increase stitch. If you make 1 to the left, it makes the stitch slant to the left. If you make 1 right, it causes the stitch to slant to the right. Now, to do that stitch, if you were doing make 1 right, you take your left needle and you go through this little spot right here. You're going to go through the back and pick up that little loop. Then you're going to take your right needle, and you're not going to go into this little leg of the stitch, but you're going to go through this one. So it's initially going to twist that stitch. Otherwise you would have a hole. So you go through there, and then you just knit it. And there's the stitch that you've picked up. To go through the make 1 left, you're going to do the exact opposite. Instead of going through the back, you're going to take your left needle, you're going to go through the front, and then you're going to take the right needle and you're going to knit through that back loop. And you've increased a stitch. Now, the confusion always comes when you're doing this is trying to keep straight whether you go through the back or the front for the make left or the make right. Now, I'd love to be able to say that I'm the one that came up with this idea, but I'm not. It was done by a man named Stephen West, I believe. And his method was to just remember a little saying. If you're making a right increase, which would be your make 1 right, remember the words, I'll be right back, which means you're going to the right, you go in through the back of the stitch. If you are making 1 left, you can just remember, she left by the front door. So that way you know if it slants to the left, you go through the front. If you slant to the right, you go through the back. So I hope you found these little tips helpful, and I hope you have a great rest of the week. Don't forget to stop by on Saturday for my regular podcast, and I'm going to go drink my tea. So if you've enjoyed this video, please give me a thumbs up, and if you haven't already, please click the little red subscribe button down below. Thanks so much for watching.